jump in and also check off the list. So my name is Ben Hovland, Commissioner of the Election Assistance Commission and the designated federal officer for the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, or TGDC. The TGDC is a 15-member advisory committee established by the Help America Vote Act to assist the Election Assistance Commission in developing the voluntary voting system guidelines. Pursuant to HAVA, the director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology serves as the chair of the TGDC, and we thank Dr. Copan for being with us today. And we can do a quick roll call. Technology allows me to get a sense of who's there, but we'll do it for formality. Bob Giles. We can also test our sound at this time.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Here.
Paul, great. Paul Luck.
Here.
Great. Linda Lamone.
Here. Linda
Great.
Lamone is here.
Thank you. Neil Kelly. If I don't say great, then we can't hear you, but you also may not be here, Neil.
Hey, Ben, this is Bob Giles. Maybe explain, because I didn't realize at first you have to unclick yourself to unmute yourself. I was muted up on the screen. Maybe that's...
That is helpful. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Mark Guthrie. I see Dan Wallace.
Speaking, here.
Let's see. Sachin, I believe
Here.
I saw earlier. Great. Mary Saunders.
I'm here.
Great. Lori Ogino. Judd Choate. McDermott Coots. Diane Golden.
I'm here.
Great. David Wagner.
I'm here.
Great. And Jeff Hale.
McDermott Coots is here. Sorry.
Thank you.
Excellent. So, thanks.
I don't know how long I'll be here. I have to step on a plane in about 15 minutes, but I'll be on as long as I can.
Great, thanks for joining for this period. So perhaps I should begin. This is Walt Copan.
Sorry, Dr. Copan. This is Neil Kelly. I just want to go on record. I was muted.
All right, thank you so much, Neil.
Yep.
Very good. And thanks for taking the time just to confirm the role. So again, Walt Copan, Director of NIST. I'm very glad to join with you here today. And as Commissioner Hovland has mentioned, in accordance with the Help America Vote Act and as NIST Director, I'm honored to serve as the Chairman of the TGDC, the Technical Guidelines Development Committee. And so on behalf of our colleagues at NIST and on behalf of the Election Assistance Commission, welcome to our follow-on e-meeting to continue our discussion of the requirements of the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, the VVSG. During our September TGDC meeting that was held at the EAC, we had in-depth and quite fruitful discussions on the VVSG requirements that correspond to our previously adopted principles and guidelines. At the end of the meeting, we have recorded a number of open issues that warranted our additional consideration, including support for E2E verifiable voting systems, barcode transparency, ensuring software independence and ballot secrecy, particularly with respect to providing support for risk-limiting audits, wireless and internet connections in voting systems, best practices for password complexity and random number generation, ensuring the preservation of log files, updated mill standards and how best to address dust contamination, and adjustments to wording in the human factors recommendations that we had reviewed. Today we'll hear updates from the NIST voting team on these issues. In addition, Sharon Laskowski will present updates for wheelchair accessibility and ADA harmonization based on comments from the U.S. Access Board and also on guidance for election officials when deploying accessible voting machines. Finally, Mary Brady will discuss progress on developing a recommendation for provisional standards considerations for a patent policy. In our September meeting, we also discussed the importance of maintaining transparency regarding the handling of public comments received in the process of modernizing our voting system guidelines. And I look forward to hearing more from Commissioner Ben Hovland about the current status of the posting of comments and to discuss with you our shared expectations and recommendations for handling future public comment processes. In addition, we'll consider adopting a recommendation for provisional VVSG requirements review and approval process, which was prepared in response to resolution number 3 from our September meeting. A specific charge to this committee to assist the EAC and by extension the states that administer elections in developing voluntary standards and guidelines for voting equipment and technologies has never been more complex nor more essential to our democracy. These requirements, together with the previously adopted principles and guidelines, provide a foundation of trust and confidence in the U.S. voting system. Our goal for the group at this meeting is to carefully consider the proposed updates and after thoughtful deliberations that we move toward adopting the VVSG 2.0 requirements and to forward them to the EAC for consideration and adoption. So again, many thanks for being on the call, for the important steps that you will take to finalize the VVSG 2.0 recommendations today. And so it's a pleasure to have Commissioner Ben Hovland provide his introductory remarks, and then we'll turn it over to NIST Voting Program Manager Mary Brady for an in-depth review of the proposed updates. Thanks, and Commissioner Hovland, please. Ben? Are we hearing anyone?
Hey Ben, this is Ben Long. Can you hear us?
He's connected at least through Zoom. That doesn't mean. Ben, can you hear us?
Hey Ben.
Just going to check our settings here to make sure that everyone's on.
Well, Zoom shows Ben here, but perhaps he's muted himself.
I believe I may have solved the issue. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Ben.
Oh, great. So let's see. I was just noting that for the most part, I covered some of the issues earlier, but did want to flag that this meeting has been called pursuant to the Federal Advisory Committee Act and has been noticed in the Federal Register and published on the EAC's website for today's meeting, and this meeting is open to the public. And I also just want to thank everyone for their attendance and participation. I look forward to a rigorous discussion and would like to just get into it. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, I'm delighted now to turn it over to Mary Brady to lead the first part of our discussion on the VVSG 2.0 updates.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before we start with the slides, I just want to do a status check in terms of the order in which we present the material. I heard just prior to the meeting that perhaps we'd like to discuss some of the issues that or not necessarily the in-depth review of the requirements, but some of the other issues that have come up prior to going into the requirement discussion?
Hi, this is Bob Giles. Yeah, that would be fantastic because, as you know, some of us are not going to be able to stay on the call the whole time. We have elections on Tuesday, so we're going to try and hang in as long as we can. So we were hoping to kind of get some of that housekeeping stuff done, and then when we get to the requirements, prioritize those on some of the more potentially controversial discussions, and this way, if we start dropping off, the less controversial stuff we can get caught up on. Just a couple of things, and one's towards Ben. Any update on us getting a copy of the legal opinion? And then, Mary, if we could jump to the provisional approval recommendation that we're going to put forward. And I think the other things are just, some of the concerns that have been raised about the public comments. And just, if we can get those out of the way, then we can focus on the requirements if everyone's okay with that.
I certainly am. Thanks very much, Bob.
Okay, while I'm bringing up, while I'm fast forwarding to the slides on the provisional standards, perhaps, Ben, you could cover the other two, any update on the public comments as well as the legal opinion.
So at our in-person meeting, obviously, now former General Counsel Cliff Tatum had expressed his opinion about the legal opinion and what that was as a recommendation to us. I don't know that I will say I am personally happy to share it. I have not specifically asked my colleagues if they are comfortable sharing that, but I can commit to doing that. And if we are all comfortable with that, I think it's something we can share. Obviously, that was a work product recommendation to us. I don't know that I view it as being particularly relevant to the remainder of this conversation, but am happy to share that if people would find it helpful, and my colleagues agree to that. So I will commit to putting in that inquiry. As far as the public comments go more broadly, we should be releasing a statement, if not later today, in the first part of next week, clarifying some issues on that. Certainly, there were things that could have been done better, and I know that we will do better moving forward. I think as far as the substance, as you all probably know, most of them, at least the comments that are substantially different in any way, have been on our website now for a while. I hope you've gotten a chance to look at those. If you were interested on some of the number issues that you may have seen reported, again, we had some technical issues that we'll explain more in depth in an official statement soon, but there's a certain element of it that it probably depends on how you count. If you have the same comment with 44,000 signers, is that 44,000 comments, or is that one comment with 44,000 people? So anyway, but we plan to put all of that out as soon as possible and let people think of it what they may. I hope that is helpful.
Thanks very much, Ben. We appreciate your commitment to doing that, and also your indication of the status.
So are there any questions before we move on?
This is Paul. I'd just like to thank Ben for bringing that up, because that was one of my concerns when I started reviewing the public comments was, how many of them were literally just cut and paste of the same comment over and over and over again. I know in our world, editorial boards of newspapers really don't treat, letter writing campaigns where everybody copies the same letter and they send 500 of them to a newspaper. They don't treat it with the same status as they treat, individual letters. And so I was just a little concerned. I mean, to say the phrase that I used when it initially struck me, what I was looking at, I said, I don't know if this is 50,000 different people or if this is 10 people with really good botnets I couldn't tell the difference.
I would say a little of both, and again, we will be releasing all of the information we have, I believe, fairly shortly. So hopefully that is instructive.
Great, thanks so much.
So with that, Jerome, I think we're having some problems displaying the desktop on this side. If you could enable sharing, that'd be great.
You should have it now.
Oh, perfect. Great, thank you.
And this is Paul Lux again. I just want to let everybody know I am not looking at your screen because I am in a car en route to another engagement elsewhere. But I do have the slides in front of me on paper, so I will be following along. But I'll keep my phone muted so we can keep the road noise reduced.
Let's hope you're not driving too.
Nope, I'm definitely not driving.
Great.
No,
concerned about your safety.
So Mary, you'll walk us through provisional VVSG resolution number 3.
Okay, so there's just a couple slides on this. You all received a copy of the process for pushing forth a provisional standard, and I do think there's some places at the end that I'd like to have some feedback from you. So let me just start, and for the benefit of those that don't have slides in front of them, I'll read what the resolution was. The provisional VVSG resolution number 3 was from the September meeting, was the EAC commissioners should ratify a provisional requirements review and approval process for the EAC professional staff to update VVSG requirements in the circumstance where there's no quorum of EAC commissioners, and the TGDC will provide a process recommendation within 30 days. So we went back, next slide, please. So we went back and based on ANSI procedures and some guidance from the EAC General Counsel, at the time there was a bit of a discussion on this already that we benefited from. We put together the provisional standard provisional standard process that was attached to your email. And it essentially goes like this. It's initially the TGDC decides to develop a provisional version, so we're in some period of time that we believe that technology has changed or there's a threat that needs to be addressed and there's a reason that we need to update the requirements. So the TGDC kicks it off by deciding to develop a provisional version. The EAC announces the provisional version after development and approval by the TGDC. After that, the EAC starts their normal review process. So we've already been through the TGDC process. The EAC starts their normal review process with the Standards Board and a Board of Advisors reviewing for 30 days, a public review for 30 days, and responses to review comments and final preparation and deployment by the TGDC and EAC for 6 months. Next slide, please. And I think that's, I'm sorry, on the previous slide, before we talk about the right to appeal, I think one point that was brought up, and perhaps we should, as a point of discussion, is at the point where the EAC has conducted their Standards Board, Board of Advisors review and the public review, has responses and resolution to the comments, and the final preparation has taken place. Who actually gets the token to say, yes, this is a provisional standard? And I think there's a couple of options that if I think through it, the ones that I can think of, and perhaps you all can think of additional ones, is you might have a case where there are commissioners, but there's not a quorum of commissioners. So that's a possibility. I would think in that case that perhaps the residing commissioners should be the ones with the authority to go ahead and put forth the provisional standard. We may have the case, as has happened in the past, where there are no commissioners. That not only is there not a quorum, but there aren't any commissioners at all. And perhaps the appropriate person there is the EAC executive director. I believe that the EAC, and then perhaps you can confirm this, I believe the EAC has a process in place on who takes, who serves as the acting executive director if there is no executive director either at the EAC. So that's perhaps something we should discuss. But before we do, let me just talk about the right to appeal. That if in fact there are folks who are not happy with the process that has occurred or the resolution along the lines during this provisional standard process, there is a right to appeal. The TGDC makes the recommendation to the EAC, and the EAC can accept or reject the appeal within 30 days. In this case, the EAC may consult the Standards Board and Board of Advisors, and they make public all comments from its boards and decision and rationale to accept or reject. So this is just something that we feel is good, for an open and to conduct all these matters in an open and transparent way. And then finally, when when a quorum has been reestablished, when the commissioner quorum is present, then the commissioners can go through their normal process to vote to change the status from provisional to official.
Mary, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
It's Neil Kelly, Orange County Registrar of Voters. So I guess two clarifying questions. Is the VVSG in a provisional status in full force and effect? And if it is, what occurs if a vendor takes an item to market and then the provisional status is changed by the commission and reverses items that are in the VVSG?
That's a great question, Neil. That's I guess part of the problem with the provisional standard is there's no guarantee that it will become the final adopted standard. Mary Saunders, perhaps you have some advice from Nancy?
Hi, it's Mary Saunders. Well, yes, a little bit. I mean, the intention is that provisional standards then are folded into the processing of a provisional standard or a provisional amendment to a standard, are then folded into the processing as a full. I'll just use the American National Standard nomenclature, the full national standard, American National Standards nomenclature. So it's, there is certainly a possibility that provisional amendments or a provisional document would be reversed, but I think the typical practice is, at least in the American National Standards world, that the developer sees a need to update the standard on an urgent basis, and it does go through a truncated or a light consensus process, so that the odds of reversing that in a later iteration would be very slim. It's not impossible, but it's very slim that those would be then reversed. The idea is to get something out to market to address an urgent need.
Yeah, I think this is Paul in Okaloosa, Florida. To me, that sort of speaks to the question I had too, and maybe that's my answer to a degree, is who has that right to appeal that you mentioned? Are we just talking about like vendors or end users or members of the general public or what?
It's stated that any participant in the review process that would argue that the appropriate process was not appropriately followed would have the ability to take forward a appeal. So it's not any person who is in the general public, but a participant within the process.
Although in this particular case, I mean, the participants in the process are the Standards Board, the Board of Advisors, and the public, all comments from the public. So that is there a need to? I guess that's the question. Is there a need to constrain it? And if it were so constrained, how does that align with HAVA?
So can you still hear me? This is Mary Saunders again. I'm just looking back to the American National Standards procedures. The right to appeal it's not necessarily required in connection with the issuance of a provisional standard, but it's a right to appeal that the provisional standard should be withdrawn, not that there are problems with particular aspects of the provisional standard. So maybe limiting the right to appeal to the entire provisional standard should be withdrawn. With support for why.
I think that's a very good clarification point, Mary. Thank you so much.
Well, and this is Paul again, and that would be one of my concerns would be, could outside influences unnecessarily drag out this provisional process by filing appeal after appeal after appeal if it were a very broad appeal process, but something a little more narrow, like, drop it or take it, would probably be a little bit, I can see where that would improve the process. Thank you.
Yeah, I do agree. It provides some boundary conditions.
So let me just capture that as boundary conditions for appeal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that this step fills an important gap that the TGDC has experienced, and so on a personal level, I would encourage the group to consider the recommendation with this boundary condition modification, that it's either acceptance of the provisional in total, or to be withdrawing the provisional based on the appeal process. Are there any contrary views to moving forward with finalizing this recommendation to the EAC?
This is Bob Giles. I agree with moving forward. I just have a quick question for Ben. And I guess if we present this, I guess you're going to need a legal opinion on this, and I'm just curious if you have a time frame for when you think you're going to have new legal counsel. And
I'm on it, listening to a call. Yeah, it's okay. I came in.
Partial conversation.
So I think I caught the end of that, Bob, but essentially, so we have posted the job postings for executive director and general counsel. That was a 30-day posting that started recently. And as you may remember from 4 years ago, that process sometimes can take a little while, but we will hopefully be moving that along as quickly as possible. And hope that we get some great applicants. Encourage anyone you know that is qualified and interested.
Excellent.
And I guess my concern is, we're moving forward in good faith, and we think this is a pretty good compromise from where we were. But my concern is you get legal counsel and they come back with the legal opinion saying, oh no, you can't even do a provisional. And I guess that's why it's unfortunate you don't have legal counsel right now to maybe even give some initial guidance on this. But I mean, I think we move forward, but I was hopeful we'll get some kind of answer back from you guys in a timely manner, that it doesn't take as long as it took to get the other legal opinion.
Well, I would add.
Go ahead, Ben.
I would just add, well, one, we are exploring other legal assistance options, hopefully sooner than we have a general counsel on board. But I would also say that to the degree people are making a recommendation, if they want to include a legal opinion with that recommendation, it would not hurt my feelings. So whether that be from any of your counsel's offices or the NIST counsel's office, if they are so willing, that is certainly something that could be taken into consideration.
No, excellent. I think from the NIST side, we would be delighted to provide that in view of our role in standards for the nation.
Thank you.
And that side, I was going to follow up with that as part of our review process, everything that gets transmitted from us to the AC in a formal manner goes through a legal review.
Yeah. Good. So we'll look forward then to an updated version of this resolution with this clarifying paragraph inserted. And so look forward to that following on from today's meeting. Excellent.
Okay, I guess with that, are we ready to begin the review of some of the security requirements?
I'm just wondering, just in view of the recommendation that's been made regarding public comment, that perhaps we can put forward a resolution that the EAC commissioners should ratify an open and transparent public comment review and resolution process for the EAC professional staff to conduct a public review of voluntary voting system guidelines in a manner that embodies trust and confidence. The TGDC will provide a process recommendation within 30 days of this meeting. I'd like to propose that resolution for consideration by this group that would allow us then ultimately to have a more clearly documented process and expectations for public comment and resolution handling. I'm wondering if that would be a helpful step.
This is Bob Giles. I think it would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
This is Mary Saunders. I support that as well.
Thanks, Mary. Are there any opposed to such a resolution? It really provides sort of an action for the team to provide a recommendation then within 30 days. And quite clearly, the group will reconvene then to consider what has been recommended. Okay, hearing no negative commentary, thank you for the support for this resolution. We'll call this resolution number 1 from today's meeting, and we'll look forward to the TGDC taking the action and to provide a process recommendation within 30 working days. All right, Mary, I believe then we're ready to go forward with the next part of the program, reviewing the updates to the guidelines.
Great, thank you, Walt. Okay, so we're going to reverse our slides back to the beginning.
I'm sorry, Mary, can we do one other housekeeping piece?
Absolutely.
Related to this? I know that I heard from some members that, they did not believe they were going to be in a position to vote on these requirements today based on the time they'd had to review the updates. And so I had wanted to see if we could get a sense of that, number one, and then number two, if that is the case, since I know some people are going to have to drop off, if we are able to get a sense of a timeline. I know, again, a lot of our members have elections coming up, and so want to be sensitive to their timeline around that and some of the work that they will have in the coming weeks. And so wanted to try to figure out, if that is the case, what a reasonable timeline for review and a final vote is.
Ben, this is Walt Copan speaking. We've proposed a 30-day period for input on this in response to this resolution, and so perhaps we could look at 4 weeks hence to have a follow-up conversation, or potentially even a virtual vote where people could submit their inputs electronically.
Okay, so 30 days puts us in the, beginning of December timeframe.
Right.
Thoughts from the TGDC members?
This is Diane, and I would agree that I don't think I'm going to be in a position to want to vote today. To me, there were two different kinds of changes I did go through the slides and I went through all the new standards, tried to, but it is short notice to digest. the changes that were in response to our discussion at the face-to-face meeting, I'm more comfortable moving forward on because we sort of came to consensus for the most part on most of them. The problem is there are brand new things in here now that we have never discussed in depth. The whole wireless ban, the internet ban. I'm concerned about scoping on those and those being potentially misinterpreted as meaning something I don't know that they actually are intended to mean. I would be in no position to try to vote on that today. And I'm not sure, we're already a half hour plus in, I'm not even sure by the time we walk through all the changes that were in response to the meeting discussions, I think we're going to shortchange the discussion on those two big issues. I'm not even sure 30 days is going to be enough unless we have online discussion or something else. Just my initial thoughts.
Thanks very much.
But Diane, this is Paul Lutz, and I couldn't agree more. I'm glad to hear you say the same thing because I know the timing was a concern, just because most of us got this document about 24 hours ago, and as you said, it wasn't so much the stuff that we asked them to look at and change as all of the new stuff. And when you talk about scope, that was one of my biggest concerns with some of the changes in sections 14 and 15 was the idea that they're applicable to the whole voting system, and then you go look in the appendix at the definition of what a voting system is, and it covers a whole bunch of stuff which may or may not be applicable to that type of stuff. Never mind just the in-depth discussion that talking about banning wireless and internet is going to entail.
I hear and I understand those concerns. I've also heard that there's general comfort with the progress that has been made in response to the discussions that we had at our September meeting. And so perhaps we could look at having interim discussions to ensure that there's clarification between today's date and our follow-on meeting, so that everyone can feel that there's been sufficient discussion to actually have a vote in good conscience to forward the VVSG 2.0 documents to the EAC.
Yeah, and I agree that there is some, I sense that there's a fair amount of confusion regarding scope, and I agree that's a discussion that we have to have. The changes that we were proposing, particularly with wireless and internet, were actually not brand new, but as a result of the discussion we had around those topics at the last meeting. And yes, we do need to discuss it. Perhaps I'm a little afraid that folks are going to start dropping off before we nail down some dates. And I understand that it's difficult to pick a date, but perhaps we could put some parameters around picking a date, as in,
first week of December, right? And I'm looking at my calendar and availability, and I will be available to participate in a call just about at any day, Monday through Thursday of that week. I propose Thursday, the 5th of December, to give us a little bit more time to consider all these matters. But I'll open that up to the group.
Hi, this is
okay, guys.
Paul,
let me just say, perhaps you all could give us some feedback on how soon you'd like to see documents and the final before we have the meeting, because I think that will help us in setting a date.
This is Paul again, and I would just say that whole week I have another commitment that is going to take me out of pocket from the 3rd all the way through following my own state midwinter conference the week after. So that Monday the 2nd is good, but everything from the 3rd on is going to be a challenge for me to get it.
Very good. Then perhaps Monday the 2nd could be a target date.
And as far as Mary's other comment about how far in advance we'd like to see it, obviously the sooner the better, but I would say at least a week, or perhaps, a week involving, I say a week, I mean like 7 days. It might involve a weekend to give us time to read, digest, and that kind of stuff.
Hey, thank you, Paul. I also see that Lori has said a week, and that there's a problem with the first week in December, and that there's another meeting. There's a CSG meeting at the same time.
Yeah, this is Bob Giles. I'd have the same issue with the first week in December. And I think part of the concern is for those of us that have elections next week, we're unfortunately we're going to have to put this on the shelf for about a week to 2 weeks to focus on our election. So yeah, we're talking second week of November before we kind of pop our heads back up and start looking at this again, and then obviously start sharing comments. And I think it's important. I think what we missed the opportunity this time is to have that dialogue leading up to today. So when we say I would rather have stuff as it's going along than get everything a week before the meeting. So we can focus on. There's definitely going to be a couple areas that I think need more discussion than others. So we can kind of get through those and know that the kind of the easier ones we put those to we get those done and finished, and then focus on the couple that may take some more discussion. But even a week out, I would be concerned if we got everything 1 week out. That's still a lot to digest. I'd rather do it in phases, and then as we get closer and we know, we can have a ballpark, because I think it's important to set a target date, but we'll know a week or two out if we're going to make that target or not, and rather than get everybody together and kind of at the last minute say, well, we're not ready to vote.
Yeah, so part of what we tried to do this time, which was obviously not as successful as we would have liked, is we did reach out to folks who were the primary contributors to the conversation, but not necessarily the whole group, to try to respect your time. So we'll have to broaden who we're reaching out to.
Yeah. Very good. As far as dates, then, I would personally hate to see it slip into January, but is there any other possibility during the month of December for us to find a date so that we could have this update and be able to move toward a vote, even if we do need to have such a vote handled electronically through email confirmation?
And one thing that I would flag for that, as far as logistics go, as many of you know, but so number one, I'd reiterate from our September 1920 meeting, I believe what we're talking about here is not whether or not whether these are perfect, but whether they are in a state that can be moved forward, counting backward, or looking at the timeline. Once the TGDC votes to move these forward, I know that the NIST team has some cleanup that generally happens, and that it is then forwarded to the executive director of the EAC. The EAC then forwards it to, or the executive director forwards it to the other boards. While I don't believe they're set, I think we are targeting April for those board meetings in 2020. And obviously, as you all know, 2020 will be a busy year. And so, to Dr. Copen's point, I think if it's possible to get this done in December, that would probably be preferable. But at least I think we need to establish, I feel like we are close to the finish line, and to establish a path forward to get there is important.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more, Commissioner.
And I saw Lori put it in as well. This is Bob Giles. The week of December 9th is more open for me. I don't know how it works for everyone else. I think and I know Paul has some stuff going on, but I don't know if he has any flexibility that week.
I know personally that week I'm on international travel and will not be accessible. So we could look at the the beginning of the following week, as we are in the 16th of December or the days immediately following.
So we'd probably be out to, I know there's another event that's going to take place on the 16th, so 17th may end up being a travel day for folks. 17th, so we'd be looking more like, I guess, the 18th.
It's certainly workable on my side on the afternoon of the 18th, same time.
Yeah, and that whole week looks good for me as well, Mrs. Paul.
That works for me, Mary Saunders.
Dan Wallach here, all good for me.
Good for Diane also.
All right. Sounds like we have honed in on a target. So let's plan then for Wednesday afternoon, the 18th of December, and confirmation to follow.
Okay, so that gives us a drop dead date of the 11th to get everything out to you for review, and hopefully engagement will leave you alone for a week after your elections. But but perhaps between that date and the 11th engagement.
And I think to the point that was raised earlier, to the extent documents are available earlier, they'll be provided rather than waiting until the week before.
Yeah, this is Bob Giles. I agree and really reiterate that if you send me something that's going to take me 20, 30 minutes to read, I can probably squeeze that in here and there, as opposed to something that's going to take me 5 hours at the end, and then I'm just don't have 5 hours. So that would be fantastic. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Bob. Okay. Well, I think we've taken care of a lot of our housekeeping matters. So are we ready to go forward with the update, Mary?
I think we are.
All right. Thanks.
Okay, so where are we then? So I think, in the interest of time, the first several slides are the summary of major changes, and given that we're going to go into a fair amount of detail, and for each of them I don't want to belabor these slides and take up too much time, but essentially they are the same topics that Dr. Copen iterated in his opening remarks. So it's the baseline E2E verifiable requirements, wireless and internet, best practices for password complexity and random number generation, being unable to print the ballot in the selection area after a voter casts their ballot, to prevent the deletion of logs, barcode transparency, updated information on the mill standards, and several human factors related clarifications, and finally a plan that Sharon will present on guidance for deploying ballot marking devices to support the no discrimination clause that we discussed last time. So, I'm sorry, we already did the VVSG provisional standards, and if we have time then we can have a discussion surrounding patents. So with that, let me pass it over to Gemma Howell so we can begin the discussion of the security requirements. I think they probably constitute the ones where there'll be a fair amount of discussion.
Great. Gemma, over to you.
All right. Thank you very much. Gemma Howell here. My requirements are kind of in the order of the controversial topics. So I put the ones that I thought were going to be most controversial up at the top. So I have E2E, wireless, and internet up front, and then some of the other ones that were mentioned before as the last four. So unique identifiers added for auditing, random number generation with the concerns around aggregation and ordering, preserving log integrity, and then password complexity. All right, next slide. So for the E2E requirements, end-to-end verifiable requirements, give me 1 second here. Just adjusting. Okay. I did not copy and paste all of the requirements into the slides, but many of the updates fall under Section 917 under Principle 9, which is auditability, and Section 916 is all about the all of the end-to-end verifiable requirements. So here in the slide, I give an overview, and I'll speak in detail about each one. So that first one there would fall under 916A and A.1. So the use of an external process for evaluation and validation of the cryptographic E2E protocols. We certainly recognize that these types of systems are not currently available, but definitely in the works. But also feel that there should be some kind of standard public process for evaluation and validation of the protocols, end-to-end verifiable protocols that are being used. And so we state that in a requirement that process, that the protocol must go through that process, and that process will be identified by the EAC. So ultimately, it'll be this would point to potentially a list of validated protocols that have already gone through the process, maybe something similar to a validated cryptographic module, or some type of process, for example, the review of TLS protocols. So some type of process will be should be established in this area, and this requirement is kind of set up. So once that process is established, that it can be pointed to. Next in the requirements, A2 is about just that implementation must be open and publicly available. And then 916B and B1 is all about the CAS's intended verification. So ensuring that the voter has the evidence necessary to review their ballot as CAS's intended, and also that the documentation is available for how the voter uses that evidence to verify that it's CAS's intended. Under C, that goes into the ballot receipt. There was discussion around there, and Sharon will go over it a little more in her section. She made updates in her section, but something that was included under C was that these ballot receipts must be accessible, verifiable, and preserve voter privacy. And then under D, 916D, one of the properties for end-to-end voter verifiable systems is that it's able to export the ballot tabulation evidence for the public. And then when you jump down to F, that also gets into the documentation of the method for that ballot tabulation verification. And then lastly in that section, something that came up during our last meeting was a reference implementation information being available for a tool and verifiers supplied. We list two there, one for the voter to verify their specific selections, and then also for verifying the ballot tabulation results. All right. Any questions there before I move on? Sorry.
Great, thank you.
And then just a few more changes in this area under the ballot secrecy section. The indirect associations, which are, just a reminder there, those are indirect associations that only apply to paperless systems, and they are used to handle provisional ballots. One of the identifiers are applied to those indirect and encrypted ballots. And sorry, I'm getting this mixed up. Let me step back. So these ballots are encrypted and they use indirect associations. And the one clarification that we wanted to highlight was that the actual indirect associations are not encrypted with the ballot. And then, and lastly, in the data protection section under 13.3B, In that section, we omit the end-to-end verifiable cryptographic protocols from having to go through that FIPS 140-2 validation requirement. But to that point, they do have to meet the requirements that were mentioned up in 916A around that validation process. But other commonplace cryptographic operations that they might use would have to go through that validation. Any questions on E2E before I head over to wireless? Okay, so the main update in wireless falls under 14.2D. So no wireless networking, basically stating that the voting system must be incapable of wireless connections. And what we did here is we definitely took into consideration the feedback that we received last time. We discussed different potential use cases for wireless, and the one primary use case that came up was the use of assistive technology in the future. And so we worked with Sharon in the human factors section and on the human factors team, and had discussions with them around, what are the current options available, and what does this look like for the future, and what is the impact of this requirement in the polling place. And so this is strictly limiting no wireless capabilities within the voting system itself. It does not require the removal of wireless hardware, and that is definitely taking into consideration some of the cost and devices that would be available that don't have wireless components within them. And the potential increase in cost for developing special devices that don't have wireless devices. And so instead, we look to secure configuration in disabling those wireless capabilities. And with that, we wanted to know what other options, if the voting system didn't have wireless, what alternative options for assistive technology would be available. And what we found was that currently folks are able to use an adapter that goes into the 3.5 millimeter headphone jack, and that currently allows folks with maybe a wireless headset or a hearing aid to use their wireless technology through the headphone jack.
Gemma?
Yes.
Oh, hi. This is Neil Kelly, Orange County. I'm just curious if maybe some insight on the debate internally, whether this is an overreach or not, because California in 2007, the legislature made a decision to prohibit any wireless transmission in a polling place or on a system. And that was a decision, that California made, irregardless of how a system was certified. So it seems to me that this really should still fall under the heading of, the state should make this decision. So I'm wondering if you could address that, or maybe somebody could address that.
This is Bob Giles. Just to kind of follow up on that, I was going to ask, have you guys reached out to the vendors to see who is making equipment with this capability, and if they have any customers that are currently using it? I'm just curious if it is being used anywhere in the country, and it kind of ties into what Neil is saying, are states allowing it, or are local jurisdictions? Because to me, that obviously that changes things in that if people are using it, we need to address it.
And this is Paul. And I kind of, my biggest concern when I started looking at the Section 14 stuff and Section 15 stuff was the way it all tied into the voting system, which I understand these are the voluntary voting system guidelines we're talking about. But if you go into the appendix and look at the definition of a voting system, it includes generating reports, transmitting election data, archiving election data. All of that stuff is included in the definition of what an election system is. And if what the intent here is to reduce the attack size of election management systems or of tabulating devices that are deployed, then let's maybe dial that back to something a little more narrow, because hitting the broad definition of the way we in the appendix have defined voting systems sounds like I will not be able to take an export file from my election management system and use the internet to upload it to my state so that they can get the election results. I'm fine putting it in the mail to them and they can get the results in 5 to 10 business days. But at the end of the day, everybody wants the answer on election night. And there are too many local jurisdictions who rely on that kind of wireless connectivity, whether you agree with it or disagree with it. I think a ban on it in a voting system, again, just to reemphasize Neil's point, exactly that. It should really be left to the states or the individual jurisdictions.
And this is Diane, and I'm going to piggyback on that same thought. It's a scoping issue for me. And Gemma, in your discussion at one point, you talked about in the polling place. Well, that's a whole different issue than when you're doing a remote ballot delivery in a remote voting system. I mean, this paired up with my concern is this, along with the internet, restrictions, are going to be interpreted as a ban on wireless, a ban on internet, which were the over and over comments coming in from the security folks. That's going to be played as no remote ballot delivery, no, things that I don't think are intended to be prohibited, but that's how it's going to play out.
So, Paul, first off, thanks for pointing out the definition of the voting system in the appendix. So we'll go back and review that to make sure it's consistent with the scope. Gemma, did you want to talk a little bit about scope?
Yeah. Just for a little background on kind of where the requirements fall, what falls outside of the requirements, and some of your concerns about potential limitations. The wireless and internet requirements don't necessarily restrict things from happening. For example, Paul, you mentioned the transmission of election results over the internet or over wireless or cellular. That could still happen, but the way that is done would just be separate from the voting system. Totally understanding that the way that the voting system is defined in the glossary may not match up with what I'm about to say, but what you mentioned about exporting files, once you export those files, you would then have to manually transport that to another system, or you can transmit those separately, as you normally would do through the cellular, wireless, or over the internet. As long as that system is not physically connected to the voting system, those capabilities are all still there. We just don't cover those within the VVSG. Those are the way the requirements are written. Those would be those types of systems that transmit the election results would be separate. Definitely the intention is not to restrict how the election results are transmitted, but just to say that it has to be separate or air-gapped from the actual voting system. And where the requirements stop is that ability to generate the reports or files that would be transferred over. And as for wireless, the same thing for wireless. So we definitely didn't want to impact the use of assistive technology within the polling place, or just the general use of wireless devices within the polling place. The VVSG doesn't have control over the user's devices, and so that's why it was limited to what wireless would be in the voting system. Also, one more thing on the other end, for things like e-poll books and activation of the ballot, that would be, again, that process would have to be air-gapped, and so the e-poll books would not be able to be connected to the rest of the voting system. So the voting devices, the ballot marking devices, the tabulation devices, and they would have to be air-gapped, so that actual activation process would have to be some type of manual transfer rather than a internet-connected one.
So I think what we're going for in a generalized way is if you have other components of your election infrastructure that are connected to the internet, we'd like to see an air gap between them and, what constitutes the voting system. If there are other use cases that perhaps we haven't considered, then, please, let us know. I mean, we're trying to get this right.
Well, so I mean, I know when we spoke back in September, at one point when we were talking about Bluetooth printers and Bluetooth is bad, so let's do away with that. Okay, fine. I said, yeah, we can attach a cable to a Bluetooth printer and plug it in if we have to. But I mean, you look at 14.2E where it says, you can't connect to any device that is capable of establishing a connection to an external network. To me, that sounds so overbroad that you are limiting the technology. And I just think this, when we're reading statutes in statutory language, if a particular section of a statute has a definition, that definition is what, when we use this word in this part of the statute, what it applies to. And the fact that our own definition of voting system in this, and this says voting systems must not be capable of this and may not do this, that flat ban, I think, is going to be prohibitive of developing any new technology that might be okay to use, and now we're still not allowed to use it because we built this into the standard at this point, and I think this is a colossally huge overreach for this type of, I understand what they would like us to do and what they would prefer, and if you want to make this the #1 gold standard best practice, that's great, but if you stick this in a standard and the state, because they're voluntary, chooses not to use it, that state, and coming from Florida, I know what I'm talking about, is going to be beat up in the media should anything happen to say, oh, well, see, they're not even following the minimum standards that were established by the government. So,
okay,
that's where the danger lies.
So let me just try to re-articulate what I think I'm hearing from you, just to make sure I've got it, that we understand that there's a problem with the definition of a voting system, and we'll fix that, okay? So, we'll constrain the definition of a voting system. But I think what I'm hearing from you is you don't yet have a use case for wireless within what we're talking about, should be a voting system, but there might be one in the future that you're concerned about limiting. Is that correct?
So right now I have 52 precincts, 42 polling locations to serve those 52 precincts. And some of them are so remote that it would literally take an extra 30 or 40 minutes on election night before they could before the memory device from the tabulators are going to make it to Election Central. If I can't use the internal modems on my tabulators, because now they won't exist on the new tabulators that my company builds in response to these new guidelines, my election results are going to be delayed, which means my state's election results are going to be delayed. God forbid you go out to some of the counties out west in Wyoming and some of the wide spread out places like Idaho and elsewhere, where they probably rely even more heavily on this type of technology for the transmission of election results from tabulators to Election Central. Like I said, to me, this is a very slippery slope, and by setting this up, then what vendor anywhere is going to say, hey, let's develop a new technology that'll 100% make sure that this is a really secure connection, that people will be able to use this? No, who's going to build to the standard when your standard says don't build this?
Okay, so
this is Dan Wallach. Can I jump in for a
Sure, go
second?
ahead.
So with other aspects of the VVSG, we have a statement of principles, and then we refine down to specific rules. And I think what we're missing here is the statement of principles. So there are several reasonable principles, like we don't want to have an avenue where attackers on the internet can potentially reach voting machines and tamper with them. Similarly, we want to make sure that there isn't an avenue where bad actors on the internet can reach into tabulation systems and tamper with them. And when you state some principles like that, now those can be refined down into, for example, like if we're going to have election results reporting, it would be unofficial over a carefully controlled, internet situation, perhaps by copying data in one way, whether it's with CD-ROM or whatever, and then that would be unofficial, followed up by a physical courier to double-check it during the canvass period. So we can refine some high-level principles down to workable practice. But the high-level principle that we're worried about bad actors on the internet trying to tamper with voting machines and or the election night tabulation, those are reasonable concerns that we do have to consider.
But I think, Paul, your use case is you have an integrated system where you have tabulation and a modem that transmits your results.
Correct.
And
in the good old days of, and I'll use a bad word, I'll say debold. In the days with my old debold system,
collective gas.
we were using 14.4 modems. You controlled the physical access of those with dip switches. You could control how that modem behaved. So I could set the modems inside the tabulators to say, you don't take an incoming call, period. There, I've just closed the door on anybody being able to dial in, presuming it was plugged in, all day long, which of course they were only plugged in when we were trying to transmit the results at the end of the night. But that system sounds like it was more secure than the wireless system, because now we're not talking about a piece of copper wire that runs through telephone lines. Now we're talking about signals that are just out there in the ethosphere that anybody can get their hands on. And while I don't discount the concern, that's exactly why we build processes into this to make it verifiable. So yes, when we get the election report that the tabulator printed, before it was connected to talk to anybody, we compare those to the results that were sent to us. We take that same report and we look at the number of voters that we checked in e-poll books and verify that the number of votes, the number of voters who voted are the same as the number of voters.
Paul, I think we lost you there. You cut out.
Separate.
So are you back, Paul?
Yeah.
Hey, we lost you
Okay.
at the end.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, it's rural Alabama, so sometimes you lose connectivity.
So,
or the Russians got my signal, one or the other.
Yeah. So, so another use case would be that you would use SneakerNet or some other way to move the results from your tabulator to another system that would be connected to the internet in order to transmit, or that would have a notifier or something like that. You don't think that's workable?
Well, but what's it going to transmit it to? It's going to transmit it to, not to my election management system, because my election management system is part of the voting system by the definition. So you still can't modem into that even from another device. So my choices are have all of my precincts drive the thumb drive to my office and we plug them in individually, and that's fine. We can do that. But I'm just telling you, the public, the political parties, these people have to get it in their heads that you can't expect me to have results on election night at 11 p.m. You may not get them for 2 weeks. I don't know, because we've got a bunch, I mean, there's just too much stuff going on. I mean, and you have to understand, and so coming from Florida, we're a little bit more sensitive about this. The state of California, I can call the state of California for you for next year right now. The state of Texas, maybe a little less so, but I can call the state of Texas for you. I can call the state of New York for you. What I can't call is the state of Florida for you, because nobody knows. But
so,
if we don't
like I
know,
suggested earlier, I think everybody agrees that this definition of a voting system needs to be refined to avoid your concern. But nonetheless, it is still important to maintain, especially because Florida is exactly the kind of state a foreign nation-state actor might try to target. So we need to have things to prevent election night reporting going through the internet in a way that it might be attackable. So it's not to say we need to ban it, but we need to carefully have a principle that explains what we're trying to protect and why, and then procedures using air gaps, using making copies, treating them as unofficial and verifying them later. We can solve the problem and still satisfy the needs of the security. We can get you election night reporting, and we can try to protect ourselves against nation-state actors trying to attack our elections. These aren't mutually exclusive.
This is Bob Giles again, and it gets back to what I raised earlier. Has anybody reached out to the vendors? I mean, we only have a handful of vendors to get these use cases. I mean, we have a few election officials on the TGDC, and we're getting use cases from them. But and whether it's the EAC or NIST and says, okay, vendors, what are the scenarios where, whether it's internet or wireless, that you have customers currently using it or customers asking to use it? What development do you see down the road? And then I think we can have a much more educated conversation about this, and then discuss, whether there are some best practices and better ways to do things. But right now we're just kind of, okay, Paul does it one way. How do we address that? I'm just concerned that we go down a path, and then a month from now, somebody comes out of the woodwork and says, well, we do it completely differently. You guys didn't even address that issue.
And we can certainly reach out. I mean, we've reached out to some, but, you're right, there could be other use cases, and there's only a handful of vendors. John runs a group that a number of the manufacturers participate in, so we can do that, but it would also be helpful if those of you who are representatives from the Standards Board, in particular, if there's a group that you could reach back into to see if there's, other folks that perhaps we're missing.
This is Diane. Can you guys, in terms of use case, talk about remote ballot delivery, remote ballot marking, all of those systems that people are using for UOCAVA, using for some disabled groups, and what a quote-unquote internet wireless ban is going to do to those methodologies?
This is Sharon Laskowski. So that's always the remote ballot marking, mail-in ballot has been out of scope for the VVSG, so it would not apply.
I don't think that's clear.
I mean, we could work on it. That would be another set of requirements.
Yep.
I don't think it's clear that's out of scope at all. I understand that they don't go through the certification process, but the way this VVSG is written, it specifically talks about that, and even in the human factors talks about those standards applying. So I am not at all convinced that A, it's clear it's out of scope, and B, if it's not explicitly clear that that's out of scope, then I can guarantee you this ban on internet, ban on wireless is going to be used to try to shut down those remote ballot delivery systems, ballot marking device, etc.
That's a fair point. We will go through the human factors section to make sure that that scoping is very clear.
Excellent.
And this is Bob Giles again, and I think some of it's going to be perception. And you're right. When the headline reads, TGD says, no internet, no wireless, that's all people read. So we have to be really careful how we move forward with this and how we're going to address it, because you don't want, and to kind of some of the earlier points, you don't want the public outcry to be, hey, I read, why are you doing this? There's no internet, there's no wireless. And to Diane's point, then it starts to bleed into the disability community. So I just think we need to be very careful how we word everything.
Yeah, those are excellent points. We'll take them on board. Okay, Gemma, shall we proceed?
Sure. All right. So under the unique identifiers added for auditing, we discussed under 915F, this requirement was about unique identifiers that are added for things like risk limiting audits. And one piece of text that was in there was around, that's said or affixed by some other external mechanism, which would be a stamp or something like that. So it's totally reasonable to remove that because that is outside of the voting system. So that was removed there. And another concern in this area that was discussed was the voting system's ability to print these unique identifiers on the ballot after the voter casts their ballot. And we made two updates in the requirements, one under the software independent section under 911C, stating that the mechanism for providing documentation for software independence must include, sorry, give me 1 second. Here we go. Get back on track here. Must include information about how the system is software independent, and that this may include how the system handles ballots after a voter casts their ballot. And then I include some examples such as, is it able to print on the ballot, what type of information is printed on the ballot, and where that information is printed. One additional requirement to assist in preserving that software independence is under 915G, and that's printing on that's being able to print on a paper ballot, and that's a requirement saying that the voting system should not be able to print in the area where the ballot selections reside. And so that's, sorry, go ahead.
And again, this is Paul. I would just point out again, while we're looking at that definition of voting system as it relates to, again, you're talking about once the ballot has been submitted, the device it's being submitted to is what shouldn't be allowed to print in the area where the voters' ballot selections were made. But the generalized voting system term might need to be looked at.
Thanks, Paul.
Good point.
Hey, Paul, just one note on that. Is it helpful that the requirement states after the voter casts their ballot, that the voting system isn't able to print in that ballot selection area?
Well, except that, again, it's saying that the voting system must not physically be able to print in the area where, and so, my election management system is part of the voting system, but it's not going to print anything anywhere, at least not there. But I mean, I just want to be cautious of that over generalized use of the term voting system when what we're talking about most likely is a tabulator.
Gotcha. Any additional questions there? Comments? All right, next up, this slide is titled Random Number Generation. This came up around, in the ballot secrecy section, there's a section, a requirement on aggregation and ordering, and there was concerns about the unique identifiers or potential identifiers that are used there, and how do you ensure that you aren't able to recreate the order. And one of the recommendations that was provided was that we point to specific NIST guidance. And so the requirement 1022F now points to that random numbers generated must use the guidance from NIST SP 890, which are recommendations for random number generations using deterministic random bit generators. The document provides very detailed requirements around number generation, and also states that to ensure conformance with guidance, that it must be submitted to the cryptographic module validation program, as well as the cryptographic algorithm validation program. So definitely wanted to give a heads up on that it will require some additional testing to be done for approval. And then we had another requirement in 917C, just about random numbers in general, so not necessarily about the numbers that are used for aggregation and ordering. And that states that the documentation of how random numbers are used and created must be there, and that also points back to this 1022F requirement. Next up is preserving log integrity. So this one, we had a requirement that originally just said disabling, no disabling of logs. And so you all provided a great update to the title, and we made that update. And then we also added added the prevention of the deletion of the logs. Last time I brought up some concerns around this potentially limiting creating space for more storage of logs. And so I included one exception for log rotation. And again, log rotation is when the stored logs are rotated out to just create more space for continuous logging. All right, and the last slide here is for password complexity. 1132B. Originally, this requirement said that the administrator this was the requirement that said the administrator was able to set the minimum password complexity. This requirement has since been updated to point that to NIST guidance, saying at minimum they must meet the complexity guidance within NIST SP 863B. And I just wanted to provide some background information on that. The minimum complexity requirement that NIST recommends is a password length. And only a password length, and the password length is 8 characters. And this is due to research around different complexity requirements, and understanding that any more complex requirements for passwords may increase the difficulty of memorized passwords and increase user frustration. And also more complex passwords impact usability and memorability. And so alternatively, what we have in the requirements, you'll see down at the bottom 1132C is password blacklist, which was retitled, and that one is about preventing the use of common passwords. And we also have another requirement around failed log attempts to provide guidance around options for preventing brute force, such as exponential backoff. So adding time onto incorrect or failed attempts.
Hey, Gemma.
Yes.
It's Neil Kelly, Orange County. I hate to ask you to go back a slide. I'm glad this is on the phone, because if we were in person, people would be rolling their eyes at me right now. But so. In the log rotation piece, is there specifics, and I'm sorry, I haven't dived into that piece, about how the log rotations, or how the logs are preserved in rotation? Or is there clarification on that?
That's a good point. I don't know if we have specific guidance around you're talking about preserving the logs, like afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I don't think we have anything in there now. Are you looking for that as a requirement or as maybe a suggestion within the discussion section?
I think it's yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, it sounds like it may be appropriate for that to share some guidance around that in the discussion.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you for that feedback.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah. And then that's pretty much it. 1132B still has it so the administrators can specify password strength. I don't know that I necessarily received feedback on removing that, and if that 1132B requirement is enough. But it's still in there that the administrator can specify additional password strength. And that's it for my section.
Yeah, this is Paul Gemma. On that point with the administrators, it's probably okay. I mean, it really will depend on how layered your organization is. In my organization, it's the same person doing all that stuff, but in Neil's organization, there may be layers of people who are telling other people to do this and set these passwords, and so it's probably okay, I would think.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, so I think next we have John Wack for just a couple of updates, I believe.
Hi, everybody. I do have some, I'll just say, relatively boring type of requirements, so I hope I don't hear snoring on the phone. So essentially, these requirements make some things more clear about use of barcodes. And then I'll also cover an upgrade to a more recent version of the military standards that are used for testing for environmental aspects. And Neil Kelly brought up something about dust contamination that proved to be pretty interesting, so I'll talk about that as well. So the transparency requirements are the place where we had barcode-related requirements. And what I did was, in response to some of your comments, made it more clear that the voting systems manufacturer must provide documentation intended to be publicly available at no cost that fully describes, well, actually, I'm sorry, we're looking at the, I've got ahead of myself. We're looking at the first one, which really deals more with system event logging, so my apologies. It was made clear in that the log format must be publicly available. We produced a common data format for export of the log, but it wasn't totally clear that the documentation, so you can actually decipher the material in the common data format. We didn't make it clear that that needed to also be publicly available. So what I'm talking about is if in the log file you use an event code of 37, and 37 means ballot cast, then that needs to be in some sort of report or document that can be made publicly available so that an auditor, if looking at an event log, knows what they're looking at. Okay, so I got ahead of myself. I'm back to where I ought to be. Again, specification of common data format, usage, publicly available at no cost, and then to barcodes again. So we had requirements already about if a barcode is used, it needs to be a standard that is freely available. And HAVA has a requirement in it that the VVSG cannot contain essentially material that costs money for people to implement. So this would need to be made publicly available at no cost. Encodings. So this is an area where you had some comments. We made it more clear that within the barcode, the data that's put into a barcode may itself be encoded. So that format needs to also be described. And the intent there is that an auditor or potentially even a voter could use a commercial off-the-shelf barcode scanner and see that encoded data, and with documentation from the vendor, be able to decipher what that means. And then we added, let's see, is it up some? Okay, the last requirement, ballot selection codes, you discussed. And what we're talking about there is, again, the same thing with the event log format. So typically, the encoded data there are a series of codes, for contests and for ballot selections within those contests. So again, if there's data that says 37, 50, and that means in the state Senate race, so-and-so was chosen, that needs to be made available, or the voting system must be capable of producing a report that a voter potentially or an auditor could use to actually decipher the information. So it's not, I wanted to be clear, it's not that we're saying that what the voter put in the barcode, it needs to be publicly available. It is the meaning of the codes. So is that fairly clear before I move on?
John, this is Paul. I'm just going to wave the same flag from the last discussion about the use of the term voting system here. So because that is so broad of a context, arguably the tabulator at the polling place should be able to produce a report that explains this to a voter, which what I printed on, because all I have to print is the tape I print results on. Whereas, and most of the time it is a more standard, it doesn't say these are votes for John Smith, it says these are votes for the second candidate in the third race on the ballot, which, explains it, but at the same time doesn't explain it. So I just want to be sure that we're not being too overly broad again with that use of the term voting system. Somewhere you got to be able to produce this, and even perhaps for an election. So I know in my old system, I had a report I could print that said, here are the names of all the candidates who are assigned to these places in the race. But that came from the election management system, which, yes, is part of a voting system. But where that tabulator is also part of a voting system, it couldn't produce that report. So I just want to make sure we're not being overbroad.
Okay, thank you. We are going to look at the definition of the voting system and take a look at that. But, you do understand we use that term in a lot of requirements so that we don't restrict something, a requirement to a specific device. So the intention there is not to lock down, kind of like a physical architecture. But I think we can handle that through re-examining the definition of the voting system and then discuss it with you.
Dave Wagner here. I would imagine that an implementation would most likely meet this by having the EMS produce the report exactly as you suggest. And it looks to me like the wording of this language allows that, but also provides flexibility to the voting system manufacturer that if for some reason it made more sense to have some other part of the voting system produce that report, that would also comply. So I think that's consistent with what you're saying, if I understood what you said right, but I don't know if I understood the concern accurately.
That was my intention, David. Thank you. Okay, well, we'll revisit that. The next thing is the MIL Standard 810 update. So there are a series of requirements that require voting systems to be resilient to a number of different things: temperature, humidity, vibration, dropping, electrical issues. And the standard that was used is a military standard that is in widespread usage. People use it all over the place in industry. It it can be modified because, you don't always need to test something to military standards, but there's a lot of flexibility in the standard. So the version that was being used was 810D, and we're up to 810H, I believe. If you look up 810D on the internet, you're going to find that someone scanned in a typewriter-written standard from way back, and so I think it was important to move on and make things more recent. Now, very fortunately, the 2007 VVSG effort at NIST intended to upgrade that to version F. And a study was done to look at the differences between D and F. And there were some differences. I would classify them as minor. The person who did the report also felt that in some respects, perhaps some things were being tested for that really didn't need to be tested for, some aspects of the drop tests. This is something I intend to discuss more in the testing group, but I then took a look at the differences between F and then the current version H, and there were no differences. The differences between the versions were really more in how the material was presented. So anyway, we did an update there, and I think that's fairly clear. And you'll just see that in section 2.7a, these requirements are highlighted in yellow. Okay, the very last issue. Neil Kelly raised that his systems are suffering from dust contamination. We would like to get more data, and in fact, it's an interesting enough problem that perhaps we'd like to reach out more to more election officials. The 810 standard does contain tests that can be used for dust contamination. It would add expense to certification testing. Dust can be kind of specific to certain areas of the U.S., and so it's a little more difficult to come up with a test that's general. It would need some work, but it can be done, and it seems to be, an important issue in Orange County. So again, we'll be reaching out to get more data about that, and perhaps after the public review, if we need to add this sort of testing in, we can do it at that point. And I think that's it.
Hey, John, Neil Kelly, I just wanted to say thank you for addressing that issue, because I know it's not just in our county, but it does take place certainly in the Southwest in larger numbers. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much.
So I think next up we have Sharon Laskowski. I think, Sharon, you have about 15 minutes.
Oh, I can do that easily. Because most of the changes we made were just to clarify. They weren't major substantial changes, except perhaps the accessibility of E2E receipts, making that explicit, and also a plan for how to develop some guidance and understanding of how to deploy ballot marking devices to support no discrimination for the people that use them. So that said, I'm going to go through these rather quickly. We had a comment about voting methods and interaction modes, and there was some confusion. So we revised that. And next slide, then.
They're right there in front of you.
Yeah, there we go. And so we added the term voting methods in 5.1a, voting methods and interaction modes. So within any method of voting, all interaction modes have the same capabilities. And we also added in the discussion that methods of voting might support a number of different types of voting. But in light of our discussion about being careful about scoping, maybe we want to revisit this discussion wording to make sure we haven't overreached there or make that clearer. But that was a simple change. In 6.2 A, voter independence, we revised it to make sure the accessibility of any kind of E2E receipts was clear. So the update that we did was to add a subclause to 6.2a that says if a voting system includes any features voters might use after casting a ballot, they must be accessible. So we brought it in a little, not just E2E receipts, but anything that some future voting system might have, like a voter being able to track their ballot in the system, et cetera, that is indeed accessible. So, next slide. We had a question in the last meeting about the scope of what's a common gesture. And in looking back over 7.2e, there was a complete list of 6 required conditions that really limits what the gestures are. And we said, okay, so maybe that wasn't entirely clear, so we reordered them. So if you look at the next slide, there's really been no change. We just ordered what's there, and that plus the discussion really says there's simple gestures where you don't need to use more than one finger, you don't require any kind of timed or simultaneous actions, and you don't navigate off the current context. So that really limits it to just a couple very simple gestures. Moving along, we showed our wheelchair reachability, accessibility requirements to the access board, our access board, and we found out that they've got some new technical guides for the space one needs around a wheelchair to reach controls and operate those controls. So basically, we updated the requirements. And for example, and I must say they're beautifully done. So much improvement over what we used in 1.0 back in 2002. They're very clear. And so we basically say follow here's the clear floor space and turning space you need. Here's reach and height and depth with illustrations. Use that. And there's a whole guidance and pictures on how voters can reach and use all operable parts. And there was a small comment about in 7.2 about control labels visible. Just from a seating position, we just removed one word to make it clear. So thank you to our access board contacts for making that clear. There were some questions about the wording for usability testing with voters and with election workers. So we actually are proposing a few minor changes to the guidelines themselves. So that's for the EAC to decide whether they want to do those updates. And then we looked at the requirements underneath for how to specify that usability testing, and we made sure that there was parallel construction because we thought that would be clearer. So the current 8.3 guideline says the voting system is evaluated with a wide range of representative voters, including those with and without disabilities, for effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. We removed that last clause, effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. We put it in the actual requirement, and these are, by the way, ISO standard metrics. So you can see on slide 38 that we specify how those usability tests should be done. And in the second clause, we added the including effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction methods there. And we've got guides for how to use the common industry format for reporting on usability test results. And we've customized it for voting, so there's lots of specifications on how to do formal usability testing in this case. And then for 8.4, The current 8.4 says the voting system is evaluated for usability by election workers. We're suggesting that we say with election workers to parallel the construction in 8.3. There was a clause in the requirement itself that says that election workers can learn, understand, and perform these tasks reasonably easily. And we changed that to successfully because that's a clear measure. And then we rearranged and added to parallel the 8.3a usability test with voters to make that clear that indeed these are the same kind of usability testing, except that you're using election workers and you're looking at the specific tasks that election workers have to do with those systems. And again, to report those in a standard format. So I'm going to pause there to see if there's any questions or comments.
This is Paul. Could we provide a blacklist of poll workers to not use?
That would be up to the states. They should have a range of experience, some novice and some experienced poll workers that you test with. So you have confidence that they can actually follow the documentation, operate it. So finally, we had a question about Principle 3, which says all voters can access and use the voting system regardless of their abilities without discrimination. So we have requirements about consistency and equivalent experiences, but the question was asked, what does without discrimination mean? That depends on how you deploy the voting system, which the manufacturers can say how it should be deployed, but its use is really governed by the polling place. But it's an opportunity to provide some guidance. So we talked to Diane, and we talked with our access board about how we might make use of the NIST Human Factors Public Working Group to have a discussion as part of our plan to discuss and document the issues around deployment of accessible voting systems, which are primarily ballot marking devices. And we can do that through the Human Factors Public Working Group, which already has a large number of usability and accessibility experts and advocates and vendors. And then the Access Board has kindly agreed to lead the generation of the report. We do have an outline for guiding the discussion to bootstrap things. And we're hoping to use some of our contacts like Laurie and Bob to make sure we have the right set of election officials, perhaps from NASA and NAS, included on providing input, and we'll reach out to some additional accessibility advocates to participate in these discussions, and we'll also notify We'll notify other working groups as well, including the security folks, so they know, so we have full transparency. And then, based on the findings from that discussion, I think we'll be well poised to develop some guidance for election officials on what's a good number to deploy, and how do you make sure the election workers are ready to go to help people coming in to use the devices, et cetera. Are there any questions about that?
Sharon, well done. Thank you. You've brought us back on time, and now it's back to Mary Brady to wrap us up.
Yeah, I think there's only one additional slide that we didn't go over, and this is on patent claims. And I just kind of want to introduce the topic. I don't think there's anything that we're going to do about it in the next 5 minutes, but there has been some concern, particularly expressed by McDermott, on that the VVSG should be free of patent concerns. or if there are any patent concerns that we should be aware of them, and there should be guidance for how to address them. And I just wanted to point out that we went back, we reviewed the Help America Vote Act, and there is a section in the Help America Vote Act that says there will be no private sector intellectual property rights in the guidelines. We looked at some of how some of the other standards bodies handle this, and I guess some questions that come to mind is where in the development process should the patent policies be applied, that I think there is a need to develop some. The public working groups are unofficial advisory groups related to NIST, so they're not actually part of the HAVA-defined process. HAVA defines the development as starting with the TGDC, and the EAC has overall responsibility for the VVSG. So I think we need to have a discussion at least initially with the EAC to discuss where a patent policy might be applied. Some things, some best practices to consider from the ANSI and IEEE policies that we looked at is normally what happens in those situations is the meetings start with a chair request for participants to identify patent claims on technologies that are under consideration. The chair can also send letters to participants asking them to identify patent claims. In this case, there's a response that's signed by the senior management of the organization. And the holder must assure that there's a license to patent claims that are available under reasonable terms and conditions, and in some cases without compensation and under reasonable terms and conditions that are free of any unfair discrimination. So it's just something that I want you to start thinking about among the other areas, and if you have any thoughts, please let us know. But I'm sure this is the beginning of a discussion as we go along and work on developing a patent policy.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for the presentations and for the great inputs and clarifications that have come out of our discussions yet today. Let me turn it also over to Ben Hovland for any additional comments that you'd like to make as we bring our session today to a close.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I do appreciate the NIST team and all the work they put into this, and thank you to all the TGDC members for your comments and engaging in this discussion. We can send around follow-up. I know we talked about the 18th, but we can communicate via email to see if that is a date that will work for most people. And as I mentioned earlier, I think there's value in identifying if there are recommendations for how we can get across the finish line here and how we can review these final pieces. So thank you to everyone for joining the call today.
Ben, thank you so much. And I don't know whether on the date of the 18th or an alternative, if those who are available might be able to join in person, but I would certainly be happy to come out to the EAC and to participate directly with you there, Ben, and the others who can join us in person. I realize that some may have to call in and participate virtually. All right. Well, I think we're at the end of our time. Again, look forward to the follow-up actions. There are plenty, but I think that over the coming weeks, there's certainly a commitment from us here at NIST to provide our updates so that when we actually do meet and prepare for a vote, that everyone is well prepared and has had adequate opportunity for advanced review. We welcome, as ever, any additional comments and feedback as we prepare for what we trust will be a unanimous decision to move forward with the VVSG 2.0 guidelines. And thank you once again to each of you who have joined with us on this call, a very productive call today. Thank you.